Yes, a very good morning to you. It's Monday, the 20th of July, 2020. Welcome back to the best On Ground Weekday Kickoff. My name's Pete Fairbairn, and I'm joined every weekday by one of Australia's top sports journalists to discuss what's happening in the world of sports today. Christy Doran's with me. How are you, mate?
Yeah, very good. Very good morning too.
Great to have you back on the show. Plenty to talk about. We're going to fire straight into it. And we're going to start in the AFL, North Melbourne Football Club, a team who haven't experienced a lot of success in recent years. Brand new coach this year in Rhys Shaw, first-time coach. But they've had 5 straight losses now. They got absolutely humiliated by Richmond over the course of the weekend. And Damien Barrett in afl.com.au has written that this football club needs a full roots and branch review from top to bottom. They need to establish what they stand for, what they're going to, kind of be striving to achieve moving forwards. Talk me through North Melbourne Football Club. Where do they sit right now? How relevant are they? And what do they need to do to turn things around?
How relevant are they? I think, when's the last time they made the top 4 of the AFL finals, or the top 6? It's been a long time, probably 2007, I think it was the last time that they did, when they finished 3rd. The 21st century has been a shocking run of events for North Melbourne. They need to, I think, tap into what clubs like Hawthorn, what Richmond have done. Richmond were struggling only, 6-7 years ago. And then they've become a powerhouse of the AFL. They need to completely, you'd think, look at their draft system rather than throwing Hail Marys and trying to attract some of the better, maybe old, aging players across the AFL and trying to attract them to the club. Really look at the youth system. We know that the AFL system with the draft is a great opportunity to rebuild the club. It's surprising that the North Melbourne haven't quite done that in recent years and haven't looked to kind of to start afresh. And that's what essentially I think you need to do. But you need to have a coach which is going to be aligned with the CEO and the captain to have a long-term strategic vision about where we're going to take this club. And that's ultimately what you've got to do.
Yeah, Rhys Shaw, of course, coming in as caretaker coach last year when Brad Scott left. He's very young. We know the players love him, and we know that he is a people person and has really focused on culture, but simply doesn't appear to have the soldiers at his disposal at the moment. And you reference those Hail Mary offers. Important to note that they haven't really been successful either. It's kind of every off-season North Melbourne is in the market for a big fish but hasn't managed to land one yet. So I think a full review of where they're at and probably a bit of a clean out of the playing list there at the Kangaroos is going to be necessary at the end of this year. We move from the AFL to the NRL, and a pretty interesting story in yesterday's Sydney Morning Herald that we're going to speak to from Adrian Proshenko around potential private investment into the NRL. Melbourne Storm chairman Matthew Tripp has been involved in helping to kind of leverage some conversations with private investors, essentially the same model as what we've seen in the UK and in the Pro 14 rugby competition, with CVC coming in and buying a stake in the competition. It's an injection of funds for the clubs and for the competition itself. In the case of the NRL, they're talking about $600 million for a 20% stake for these private investors to come in. Is this actually good for a competition like the NRL to be giving away a pretty large chunk of who they are and what they do?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because the NRL, as we know, it generates more money from the broadcast deals than a lot of the other competitions in Australia do. Already, I think the rough figure at the moment is about $3 billion that we're talking about is what the game is worth. So that would be 20% of that is $600 million rather, which is a lot of money. 20% to give away when it's already raking in a lot of money. We know that the NRL, and we saw this play out through COVID-19, weren't very good at saving their money. Salaries continued to go up. What players were worth. The old idea of a player is worth $1 million started to be thrown around to 1 or 2 players per club, rather than before when we might have only spoken of an Andrew Johns or a player of that ilk. private investment is they're going to be looking for a return. You know, you don't just come in here and go, we're just going to give you a massive cash hit. They are going to be wanting to see return for their buck. So yes, they're going to lose autonomy, the NRL, if they do sign up for that. That should be hit initially, which is going to inject some money, which perhaps might be needed given COVID-19. However, we also know that Fox Sports, that Channel 9 have come back to the game, and that there are broadcast deals in place which will secure the NRL's future going forward in the short term as well. So it's really whether or not they want to give a little bit of money to the devil there and hope that short term sugar hit really pays off long term.
For those of you watching on Facebook and YouTube, you'll see the Golden Strainer makes its first appearance of the morning. That's how we make sure I let the journos know that we need to move on to our next topic. Being a rugby union journalist, Christy, there's a couple of big stories in rugby union that I want to speak to today. And we're going to speak to these next two stories in the 15-man code for a little bit longer. They're kind of big ones of the day. We'll start in the Australian with Wayne Smith, and he's written a story around the potential number of imports that that Australian teams could have in any new look Super Rugby competition moving forward. Of course, if I take you back a step, last week New Zealand Rugby announcing essentially that they want to break away from the SANZAR alliance and the competition structure involving, say, South Africa and Argentina, come up with their own competition and inviting expressions of interest from Australia to take part. That's the kind of delicate negotiation phase as it currently stands. Australia, there's a lot of question and debate about whether there's enough depth for 5 Australian teams here at the moment, which is what Rugby Australia wants from a commercial perspective. And the inclusion of imported players, whether it be South Africans, Argentinians, whether it be top All Blacks players, maybe boosting some of the Australian teams, is seen as a way to build the quality and standard of those Australian teams. And Wayne Smith reporting that Rugby Australia are looking at capping that at 3 imports per team. Do you think that balance is right for rugby to be able to continue to develop young Australian players, but also to bring in top quality imports as well?
Oh, I'm surprised that they've gone with the number 3. I think that if you're and they've already put this out there in the open, because if you're going for 5 Australian teams, which is what Hamish McLennan's preference is, I think everybody realises we don't have depth to compete with New Zealand across 5 sides. But if you were to bring in a couple of foreigners and maybe a couple more than that total, so to get to closer to 5, I think that there would be a bit more of a realistic expectation that these Australian sides can compete. So I am surprised that they've gone with 3. We know that history shows us that if you get the right foreign player, that they can be a marquee person within the sport. We've seen Jacques Poitguito at the Waratahs, who was hugely influential in the Waratahs' title success, their maiden title success in 2014. He left, and when he left, that was really the Waratahs' forward pack that really crumbled around his departure too, with the retirement of a couple of others as well. So yeah, I am surprised that it is 3. I think if you're pushing for Australia to have 5 sides, I think you'd want 5. But I think you're also pushing for a lot of those foreigners to be New Zealanders. So if you're going to go 3 foreigners, well, I think if you were to go 5 foreigners, 3 of them have to be from New Zealand. And that would be a good way to appease the New Zealanders that, yes, these players are still playing in Australia. They're still playing in the Trans-Tasman Super Rugby competition. And hopefully that they can also be picked for the All Blacks going forward.
Well, that final point you make is a really interesting one. Dave Rennie quoted in this article, of course, the new Wallabies head coach, saying he would be very happy to pick Australian players who are playing for New Zealand teams in this competition, but we don't know yet whether New Zealand Rugby would look on it in the same light, and whether, let's say, if a team in Australia were to sign a Bowden Barrett, whether from New Zealand Rugby's perspective he would be eligible for the All Blacks. It's been pretty fascinating following the dialogue across the Tasman in regards to this potential new Super Rugby competition and whether Australia is entitled to have 5 teams and I guess weighing up that performance versus commerciality argument. And Gregor Paul in the New Zealand Herald, unsurprisingly, hasn't held back this morning in an opinion piece that he's written. Anyone who follows the game closely will know that he's never backwards and coming forwards. But he's essentially written a piece that said, Australia, you are absolutely dreaming if you think that you could have 5 teams, if you think that you could be an equal partner in this competition. You don't have the playing depth, you don't have the interest in the sport, you don't have really a leg to stand on when it comes to negotiation. What was your thoughts on Gregor's piece and really New Zealand's attitude towards Australian rugby in general at the moment?
Oh, well, they'll say we're dreaming. I would say that they're probably taking the piss to a large extent. Look, New Zealand rugby are absolutely, they're the kings of rugby at the moment. But to think that they've, with 5 sides and perhaps that they could have a couple of more teams in their provincial teams to make it an 8-team home competition if they didn't invite Australia, is I think it's short-sighted. I think Australian rugby has a lot to offer. We know that New Zealanders have valued the relationship with South Africa because they play a different brand of rugby, slightly different brand. It's probably more physical, confrontational, more set-piece oriented. But with Australian rugby, we see a bit of a blend with that as well. And to win ugly, and sometimes you have to play that when you're coming up against Australian sides, is an important thing. So I think there's many things from a playing perspective, which even if you are expected to play the most beautiful, attractive brand of rugby, to be brought down a leg at times is not a bad thing. But to think that Australian rugby is not going to return is just so far fetched. I think Australian rugby is going to, with the resurgence of the 20s program, we've got some very talented young players coming through. We have the World Cup bid in 2027, a British and Irish Lions campaign in 2025. There's a lot of things to get excited about in Australian rugby, and to forget everything and not get the whole picture and just put it on the performance on the field, I don't think is quite right at the moment.
Yeah, well said. I think we've said before that essentially this is the pandemic Australian rugby needed to have, because it's given them an opportunity to completely reset, recalibrate, look at competition structures and look at the way forward. And it's actually pretty easy to be positive about the future of Australian rugby now.
Yeah, and it's a bit rich as well, hearing from Gregor Paul and other commentators who would know the Auckland Blues and the struggles that they've had for 5-6 years. They've finally managed to put half a season of good performances together. And then they start firing shots at the Waratahs, saying that New South Wales hasn't managed to find a team in 25 years of existence. Gregor Paul, the New Zealand Herald, you're dreaming.
Absolutely dreaming, Gregor Paul. You heard it here first. Our final story today, and loyal watchers and listeners of the show would know that I am a Leeds United diehard. It has been a big few days celebrating that giant football club's return to the promised land in the English Premier League, with confirmation that Leeds will be promoted this season. Still one game left to play there, but Leeds will go up as the winners of the championship. 17 years or 16 years since they were last relegated from the Premier League. Christy, from the outside looking in, I mean, I know my thoughts on all of this, but such a big club returning to the Premier League. How good is it for sport to be able to welcome one of the true giants of English football back to the top of the game?
Well, everyone that follows sport knows, and Australian sport knows, that a couple of the great Socceroos of the 21st century, Harry Kewell, Mark Viduka, came through that club. That really put them on the world, put Australian football on the world map to a large extent as well. Those couple of young kids at the time scoring goals for fun. But, Leeds, you say it's a big club. It is, and it's a one city club as well. But it's also from someone that is watching how a club rebuilds. You look at the Leeds model and what they've accomplished over the last 12 to 18 months, and it's teams like North Melbourne that should be looking at how do you channel a vision to get to where you want to get to. And you could look at multiple rugby league clubs at the moment, none more so than the Broncos probably, about how you rebuild a club, the direction, the vision, the alignment between the coach and the CEO is just so important. So it's a great story, but it's a story that a lot of teams globally should be following to go, how did they get to this stage where they're now going to be back in the Premier League?
Yeah, investment in your head coach and a vision and a style of play across any sport is just so critical, and that's what we've seen from Leeds United and Marcelo Bielsa. Christy, fantastic to catch up with you this morning, my friend. You look very well, and I'm looking forward to hosting the show with you back again sometime soon.
Cheers.
That was the best On Ground Weekday Kickoff. You can grab it on Facebook, YouTube, on the podcast app as well. We'll see you tomorrow. Cheers.